things happened to me within days of each other years ago. In 1994, my mother came to Wilmington, North Carolina, where I was living at the time, to be the keynote speaker at 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings. And at the end of that event, they had a whole day worth of events, and they had a USO style show at the end of it, and the local theater companies put it on. It was very good, and there was a big crowd going out, and my mother was sort of being whisked along by the people that were taking care of her, taking her to her limousine, whatever. My wife and I were not part of the Margaret Truman party, so we were her child. Who cares? Leave me behind. And we were sort of following along behind her. And there were two older gentlemen who were trying to get a hold of her. They were trying to tap her on the shoulder and get her attention, and they missed because she was just out the door and gone. And my wife and I felt bad about that, so we turned to look at these two guys, and both of them had tears in their eyes. And we said, "What is wrong?" And they said, "Nothing, nothing. We just wanted to thank her. If her father hadn't dropped those bombs, we would not be here today." They were Pacific War veterans. 3 days later, I was sent by my editor out to the Agricultural Extension Service, the Cooperative Extension Service, to interview a young exchange student from Japan who was giving a demonstration of ikebana, flower arranging. I didn't think anything of this. It was an assignment. I had to write a quick story. So I went out. Her name was Shizuka Otani, and Miss Otani and I talked for about 20 or 30 minutes about flower arranging. Her host was a retired judge who had, she was actually an exchange student. She was with the judge's family up in Virginia, but she'd come down to Wilmington, North Carolina for a week. And the judge was sitting off to the side, and near the end of the interview, he said to me, "I told her who your granddaddy was." And Miss Otani smiled and bowed and said, "That's very nice." And I said, "Thank you." And 2 seconds later, the judge said, "Tell me about your granddaddy, honey," to her. And she got very quiet. She looked at the floor. She was very uncomfortable. And I wasn't really sure what was going on. And when she did not answer, the judge said to me, her grandfather died in Hiroshima. And I don't know why he said that. He was, I think probably he just wanted to see what would happen, or he was, I don't know. But I don't think I would have been angry at her if she had been angry or if she had had something to say, but she didn't. She surprised me. All I could say to her, and it's the only thing one human being, I think, can say to another when you hear about a tragedy, I said, "I'm so sorry." Not, "I apologize for my country or my grandfather," but "I'm sorry you lost your grandfather." And she bowed again and said, "Thank you." And when our eyes met, I knew that both of us wanted to walk over there and dump the judge on his butt. And it was an interesting moment for me to have these two moments 3 days apart. Well, the first human story I ever saw of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was when my son Wesley the actor, the Tom Cruise lookalike, when Wesley was 10 years old, he came home from school with a book, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Some of you must be familiar with the story. For those of you who aren't, Sadako Sasaki was a real little girl. She was 2 years old when the bomb destroyed Hiroshima, and she and her family escaped relatively unharmed. But Sadako developed radiation-induced leukemia 9 years later. In an effort to help in her treatment, she followed a Japanese tradition that says if you fold 1,000 origami paper cranes, you are granted health, a long life. Sadako folded about 1,300 during the 7 or 8 months she was in the hospital, but she died of leukemia in 1955 at the age of 12. There is a statue to Sadako and to all of the children who were killed or wounded or sickened by the bomb. It stands in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park today. Wesley's teacher, Rosemary Barilla, didn't just give them the book. She taught them Japanese history. She taught them Japanese culture. They had a tea ceremony in the classroom. They folded crane after crane after crane. Wesley was folding cranes when he was supposed to be doing other things. The teacher caught him once. She caught him folding cranes behind his math book. And she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Making it for you." Did not work with Rosemary. But Wesley said he liked the story because it did not have a happy ending. It was a realistic story. And I remember telling him that it was important for him. I remembered Miss Otani and Wilmington. I remembered the two men, the two Pacific War veterans. And I told Wesley, it's important that you understand both. It's important that you understand your grandfather and your country's reasons, their point of view. It's also that you understand what that cost the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mentioned this to Kinue Tokudome, who many of you know and Jan just mentioned. Kinue was working in the States at that time, and this had been 1999, and she was working on stories about Americans with connections to the war, to the bombing, that were not what I gather Japanese audiences were traditionally getting, the sort of the mean American point of view, that this, she wanted to show that there was humanity on the other side. So she interviewed me, and she interviewed some Pacific War veterans. And that story, her proposal to her publisher didn't get published. But it was out there enough so that 4 or 5 years later, another Japanese journalist read her work and came to interview me in the States, and I told him that I had read Sadako's story. Well, that led to a phone call from Masahiro Sasaki, Sadako's older brother, also a survivor of Hiroshima. And all he said in that phone call was, "That's interesting that you read my sister's story with your son. Can we meet someday? Maybe work together. Would you think about coming to Japan?" And I said yes. We had made no plans, but I agreed to it. And it took us 5 years to meet. We met finally in 2010 at the World Trade Center Memorial, the 9/11 Tribute Center in New York, where Masahiro and his son Yuji were donating one of Sadako's last original cranes as a gesture of healing after the 9/11 attacks. And at the end of our meeting, Yuji took out a little plastic box, and he opened it, and he took out a tiny paper crane, and he dropped it into my palm. And he said, "That's the last crane that Sadako folded before she died." And at that point, he and his father asked me if I would visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I said yes. The instant I agreed to that, Yuji said he would donate a crane to the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor, which he and his father have done. My family and I went to Japan in 2012, the summer of 2012, went to both ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And between the ceremonies, we sat down with and just listened to more than 24 survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there were some real periods of grace during those meetings. Two that stand out in my mind. We were talking last night about Shigeki Mori. Mr. Mori survived Hiroshima, but about 25 years ago, he discovered that there were 12 Americans killed in Hiroshima, pilots, most of them, from a couple, I think two bombers and a couple of attack fighters. And no one really had known what happened to them because it's the end of the war, there's confusion, it's an atomic bombing. You know, the Japanese did not call up and say, "We have your people, here's where they are." It was chaos at the end of the war. So Mr. Mori spent a lot of his own time and money tracking down these 12 men, what happened to them, how they died, where they were buried, where their remains were, so that he could tell their families in this country. So although he survived Hiroshima, he was trying to reach back to this country, to the people who lost loved ones in Hiroshima from America. And Mr. Ito, Sugio Ito, Mr. Ito is a very elegant, quiet man. He lost his brother in Hiroshima and his older son at the World Trade Center. And despite that, at the end of the day on August 6th, there is a ceremony, a lantern ceremony, where you light colored paper lanterns. You can buy them from the shops. And you send those down the river as a gesture to the souls of the departed, those lost in the bombings. And Mr. Ito made his own. He made a very substantial balsa wood lantern with paper, with pictures. The mushroom cloud on one side, the Twin Towers burning on the other, picture of his brother on this side, and a picture of his son on the other, Kazushige. And he invited me and my wife and younger son, Gates, to the water's edge, to the river, to light that with him and send it down the river together. And we were talking yesterday in Jan's wonderful documentary on Ed Steele, and talking about the power of art. A parallel there's a Nagasaki survivor whom I met in New York named Yasuaki Yamashita. And Yasuaki was 6 years old when the bomb destroyed Nagasaki. He was lucky that we dropped the Nagasaki bomb off target, so the hills protected a lot of the city, and his house was at the base of a hill on the other side. So he was lucky in that. He was sick as a young man, as a young adult. I believe it wasn't leukemia, but he would get these bouts of anemia, and he couldn't work for weeks and weeks and months at a time, and then he would recover and then get a job and then lose it again because he'd get sick again. He's been past that. But he finally, just being in Nagasaki and seeing people his own age getting sick, he left the country. He went to Mexico. He is a Mexican citizen these days. And he is a very talented artist, like Ed. Like Ben, sorry, not Ed. And he and the similar thing, Miyazaki was completely self-taught, a natural artist. But when he paints, when he had his first show in Mexico, the gallery owner said, he was turning out all these beautiful pictures of flowers and trees and all these it's what he does. And the gallery owner said, why aren't you painting your experience of Nagasaki? And he said, I am. And she said, well, how can that be? And he said, well, we were told after that bomb dropped that nothing would grow for 75 years. And the first spring after the bombing, I looked up one day on the hillside and it was full of flowers. It's the most hopeful thing I've ever seen in my life. So he recreates that in his artwork. So different ideas about the role, the power that the art plays. And some other parallels that occur to me between Bataan and Corregidor and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I understand, and I did not know this until yesterday, that the survivors were not allowed to talk about it at first. Not allowed to tell their friends and families what had happened to them. In Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors were shunned. They were thought to be, first of all, they were not allowed to talk about it either. The occupation government, we went in there and basically took all of their drawings and journals and poems and letters, anything that they'd written about their experience, and collected it all. The thought being that if people really knew how horrible it was, and this seems to be true of Bataan and Corregidor, people knew the extent of the cruelty, that it would be difficult to govern the country. It would be difficult to move forward for that. So they have those things in common. I've tried, all those survivors asked of me when I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that none of them came to me in anger or recrimination. There was no hate. They came, all they said was, I just want you to hear my story. I just want to tell you what happened. And they do it over and over and over again so that we all know what it's like to live through a nuclear explosion in the hope that we don't do it again. And we haven't so far. I'm trying to figure out how to make this work. How can I best tell their stories as a writer, as a speaker? And I have, as Joe said, I have several projects going. One is a screenplay that's driving me and my partner nuts. It takes a long time to write those things, and then you look at it after a while and you go, God, this is the stupidest thing I've ever written in my life. And you put it in a drawer and you go back to it and you go, okay, no, it's not that stupid, but there are some stupid parts. So that's where we are on that. My partner and I have to start this again on Monday. I have also written a children's book with my son, Wesley, who is an artist as well as being an actor, on Hiroshima. And that is actually going to be published now, it looks like, by the press owned at Los Alamos, New Mexico. And that story for me, and I worked for a time for several years with survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, telling their story in New York with an organization called Hibakusha Stories. And they brought, the nonprofit for 8 years, brought survivors to the States, to New York, to talk to high school students about the bombings. And I worked with them for 4 years. I would tell the story similar to what I'm telling you here tonight, and then the survivor would tell his or her story, and the kids would be able to ask questions. And again, another parallel in the documentary, those kids were stunned at Ben's story. Likewise, the children, U.S. children and school children are stunned by the survivor stories. They cry, they want hugs afterwards. They all want selfies. There's a lot of that going around. So the children's book, one of the things we stayed away from, and there are a couple of stories that survivors tell about kindness shown them after the war by U.S. servicemen. Yasuaki had a great story that one of them slightly funny. I'll tell the funnier one second. The first one though was there was no food. I mean, after the bombing, they were eating potatoes pretty much. Yeah. And one day at his school, they had condensed milk and chocolate. And Yasuaki, they all went nuts, and they said, "Who's responsible for this?" Well, the American soldiers. And Yasuaki likes to tell that story, but while we were talking to the kids, we didn't tell those stories, so as not to soften too much the horror of a nuclear explosion, which is what we were there for. The other story that he likes to tell is, of course, the emperor made an inspection tour of Nagasaki as it began to pull itself out of the destruction, and made a tour of the schools, and so all the children, and of course the children, nobody in Japan had ever seen their emperor, much less heard him on the radio as they did for the surrender. So this was a big deal that the emperor was going to drive by. So Yasuaki remembers being very excited at the prospect of seeing the emperor. And then the emperor's car started coming down the road, and all the kids are lined up front. And then the teacher says, "All right, everybody, here comes the car, bow." So they all... And the emperor's car went right on by, and Yasuaki came up. I still didn't see the emperor. So... the children's book is actually, for me, it's a question of balance. If we're going to remember the damage done by the atomic bomb, we're certainly going to remember the damage done by the Japanese in Bataan, Corregidor, and throughout China. And only to be open and honest about all of that do we move forward. And this children's story is based on a real-life story told by a survivor named Shigeko Sasamori. Shigeko survived Hiroshima. She was outside knocking down homes to make fire breaks, and they were looking up at the planes. And when the bomb exploded, she put her hands up, and her fingers were burned down to nubs. And she was one of the Hiroshima maidens who came to this country in 1955 for plastic surgery. So Shigeko, but she tells a story, not very often, but she and her family were in what was left of their house in Hiroshima after the bombings. Months later, Shigeko badly burned, no surgery yet to correct anything, so she was still in very bad shape. And an American soldier showed up at their door one afternoon all by himself. He'd been cut off from his unit. I think it was a bridge that collapsed behind him, and he was stuck, and he was trying to just find some way back. And Mr. Niyamoto, she was born Shigeko Niyamoto, Mr. Niyamoto just put the man in his little boat and poled him back across the river and sent him back to his unit. And the man said, "Thank you." And they thought nothing more of it. Well, the soldier came back the next day with a couple of friends and backpacks full of food and medicine for the family. And I took that story with the help of Rosemary Parilla, the teacher that brought us Sadako's story in the first place. I took that and fictionalized it, and I used quite a bit of Lester Tenney's background for the soldier, because I wanted wounded, I wanted the hurt on both sides to be portrayed. He's angry, he's upset, he doesn't like the Japanese, but he's got this horribly burned little girl, and it just, they each take a step toward each other at the end of the book, and that for me is the whole idea. You tell the story on both sides, and you take a step towards each other. My grandfather always said that, and I kind of stay out of the argument on the bombings, because doing what I do, I will not tell an American veteran, POW, that the bombing was a bad idea, and I will not tell a survivor of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that it was a good idea. So we have to try and talk to each other. My grandfather always said that he made that decision to save American lives. He worried mightily about American soldiers. And I think the story that illustrates that most, I don't know if any of you saw it at the Truman Library yesterday, it was during the Korean War, and it was when Grandpa was out of office. He received a letter from a Mr. Banning of Connecticut. And Mr. Banning wrote him a short note. Enclosed in the envelope was his son George's. Mr. William Banning, his son George, had been killed in Korea. And he sent my grandfather the younger Banning's Purple Heart and said, "You might as well have this for your trophy case. It was your fault. Frankly, I'd rather been your daughter than my son." And after Grandpa died, and they went in to do an inventory of his working office, the one we were talking about earlier, they found that letter in the top right-hand drawer, right on top of everything, where my grandfather kept it there for the rest of his life to remind him what it costs to make a decision to send young men and women into war. It was always, he fought in World War I himself. It was always something. He worried constantly about you guys that were fighting. And I think on that note, I would rather end on a little bit of a lighter note about my grandfather in retirement. Like I said earlier, he was a workaholic, but there's certain things he wouldn't do. My grandmother got after him early in his retirement. I think the first spring she said, "Harry, the grass is getting kind of long. You need to cut the grass." And my grandfather said, "I hate cutting the grass." And she said, "Yeah, I know, but you're not President of the United States anymore. You're going to have to cut your own damn grass." And he said, all right, I'll get to it." And he didn't do it. And she nagged him a little bit, and he said, yeah, that's top of my list. He didn't do it. She nagged him a little bit more, and he said, yeah, getting right on it. And finally one morning he rolled up his shirt sleeves and he went outside and he went in the shed and he got the mower out and he started it up and went at the lawn. And my grandmother looked out the window and almost died. It was Sunday morning. Everybody else in town is going past the house on their way to church. And here's the former President of the United States, pointedly not going to church and waving at everybody who went by so they would see him. And she ran outside and she cut the mower off and she said, "Don't you ever do that again." He said, "Okay." I had a letter, I had a request from the Truman Library several years ago that said, "Would you write a letter of congratulations to a gentleman? He's 94 years old, he's retiring as the lay minister of his church." And I said, "Sure, I'll be happy to do that. Give me some background. Why am I writing the Reverend a letter?" And they said, "Oh, he used to cut your grandpa's grass." So Grandpa used church to get out of cutting the lawn and hired clergy to do it for him. A true politician to the end. Ladies and gentlemen, again, it is my honor to be here. I'm enjoying this immensely. You all, I'm certainly proud of all of you, and you all, I think, can be very proud of yourselves, as is your country. Thank you.